Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel. So this can be another fun and long video because I'm going to introduce you to a couple of items. One is a spirit that I've never covered on the channel before, and that's going to be Cognac. And the second is the amazing cocktail culture of NOLA, which is New Orleans. So first, let's start off with Cognac. So essentially Cognac is a subcategory of brandy. So similar to whiskeys that I've covered on the channel before, whiskey is the overarching category. And then you have rye, bourbon, Scotch, and Irish whiskey as a subcategory to whiskey. And the same thing goes with Cognac, being a subcategory to brandy. There's other types of subcategories of brandy, but I'm just going to cover Cognac today. So Cognac was invented in the 1500s by Dutch merchants who wanted a way to preserve French wines when traveling back home on ships. Because Dutch traders brought white wines from the Cognac region of France, and to prevent the wines from spoiling overseas, they distilled it and called it brandewig, meaning burnt wine in Dutch, which is where the word brandy comes from. Now, what can be confusing about this is that brandy did somewhat exist before this point. It was just distilled wine made in small batches by alchemists in order to treat stomach ailments. But then the Dutch are the ones who commercialized it in large batches and then gave it a name. And the purpose wasn't to create a luxurious spirit, it was just intended to create a liquid that wouldn't spoil on ships or take up lots of space. Then later in the 1600s, eventually French wine producers in the Cognac region of France took over this Dutch concept and then perfected it by now double distilling and then aging it in French oak barrels. And because Cognac was becoming a lot more popular at this point, double distilling gave it a much more smoother and richer flavor. And this is still the same Cognac that we now have today. So brandies in general can be distilled from any kind of fermented fruit juice, but for Cognac, it can only be made from white wine grapes, specifically from the region of Cognac. And there's a few different styles of Cognac, but the rules are pretty strict on how you make all of them. So firstly, Cognac can only be made in the Cognac region of France, so similar to bourbon where it can only be made in the US, or Scotch that can only be made in Scotland. Secondly, you can only use white wine grapes specifically from the region of Cognac, and it has to be double distilled using copper pot stills. And then third, it has to be aged in French oak barrels with no added sugar. So for the different styles of Cognac, you first have VS, which stands for very special, and has to be aged for at least a minimum of 2 years. Then you have VSOP, which means very superior old pale, which has to be aged for at least a minimum of 4 years. And then you have XO, which means extra old, and has to be aged for at least a minimum of 10 years. And then you have XXO, which stands for extra old, which has to be aged for at least a minimum of 14 years. Now, how does Cognac tie into New Orleans? Because before the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, New Orleans was not a part of the US, and it was originally colonized by the French, which is why it had such a strong cultural and economic connection to France, including their love for Cognac, especially since Cognac didn't spoil when traveling overseas from France to New Orleans. And Cognac became really popular with the city's super elite upper class. So the first cocktail that I'm going to do is the most popular cocktail from New Orleans, and that's the Sazerac. But before I get into making the cocktail, the history lesson continues because I'm going to talk about the evolution of this drink. So this cocktail was first invented in 1838 by Antoine Peychaud at the Sazerac Coffee House. And the Sazerac Coffee House was demolished in the late 1800s, but moved over to the Sazerac bar inside the Roosevelt Hotel. I had the opportunity to visit this bar back in 2025, and it was a really fun experience to have this famous cocktail in its new official home, inside of this beautiful historic hotel. Where the original Sazerac Coffee House was demolished sits the Sazerac House Museum, with a cool gift shop that you guys can go and check out. So initially this cocktail was made with Cognac, Peychaud's bitters, and a sugar cube with water. So I've used Peychaud's bitters a couple times on the channel already. So it was invented back in 1830 by Antoine Peychaud, and he was a Haitian-born apothecary who invented it as a tonic to treat stomach issues. So you would first make this cocktail by putting a sugar cube in a mixing glass. And then you would add 3 to 4 dashes of the Peychaud's bitters so that the bitters just kind of saturate the sugar cube. And then just a little bit of water just to kind of help break up that sugar cube. And then you would muddle it into a paste. And then you would add 2 ounces of Cognac and then stir with ice. And then you would strain into a chilled, small, thick glass with no ice. So why this cocktail wasn't served over ice? If you remember back to my milk and honey video, I had mentioned that ice hadn't been commercially available until the beginning of the 1860s, which is also the beginning of the golden age of cocktails. So even though ice was somewhat available in the 1830s, it wasn't that easy to source. So if bartenders had it, they only used it for mixing cocktails, and it wasn't economic to waste it in a cocktail glass. And then in the 1870s, the cocktail was modified to swap out the Cognac for rye and absinthe. This isn't absinthe, I know. This is an absinthe alternative. I'll get to that later. So absinthe was just added as a rinse inside the glass, just as a way to improve the cocktail. Because at the beginning of the golden age of cocktails, bartenders were becoming more creative with inventing new cocktails and even improving cocktails that had already existed. And adding a fancy import like absinthe was a great way to do that, especially since the absinthe paired really nicely with the Peychaud's bitters. And the cocktail was still served without ice, because even though during this time, ice is now commercially available, putting ice in the glass would dilute the absinthe rinse. That's how creative they were. As for the switch for rye, this was because around the same time was the phylloxera outbreak in Europe that was eating and killing all the grapes that was used for cognac. And now cognac was essentially impossible to source. So just like I mentioned in the Scotch video, when cognac production came to a stop during the phylloxera outbreak, in Europe, it was Scotch that took over cognac as the preferred spirit of choice. And in the US, and primarily New Orleans, it was rye that took over for cognac. Because rye was an affordable local resource, well, local-ish. If you remember back to the rye video, Pennsylvania and Maryland is where rye whiskey was first made in the US. And it was shipped down the Mississippi and Ohio rivers from Pennsylvania and Maryland down to New Orleans. And because all of this was happening during the beginning of the golden age of cocktails, bartenders were under pressure at the Sazerac bar to find a replacement for the cognac. Then fast forward to 1912, when this recipe was modified again, because now this is when absinthe was banned. So bartenders swapped out the absinthe for an absinthe alternative like pastis or anisette. So the reason why absinthe was banned is because it was believed to have caused hallucinations and dangerous behavior. And the most infamous example of this was in 1905 in Switzerland when Jean Lefray came home after a day of drinking and murdered his entire family. So he was drinking absinthe, but he was also drinking liters of wine and brandy and cognac. So most likely, absinthe alone probably wasn't just the cause. So scientists ended up blaming something called thujone. And thujone is a compound found in wormwood. And wormwood is one of the ingredients used to make absinthe. But modern studies have shown, in order for you to drink so much absinthe, for you to feel the hallucination effects of thujone, you'd probably die of alcohol poisoning first. And absinthe was finally legalized in the US in 2007. So that's why absinthe alternatives like pastis weren't part of the absinthe ban, because they didn't have wormwood in it. Then fast forward to 1940, this is when the recipe was changed again because the bartender subbed out the pastis for Herbsaint. So during this time, prohibition was over and people were allowed to drink cocktails again, but absinthe was still banned. And local bartenders were looking for a different absinthe alternative because pastis came from France and it wasn't that easy to source. So Herbsaint was invented in 1934 in New Orleans by J. Marion Legendre and Reginald Parker. And they created it as an absinthe alternative without the wormwood, and they wanted something that was closer to absinthe than pastis was. And this is where the history lesson ends, and this is still the same recipe for the Sazerac that we have today. It's been common to swap out the sugar cube and water for just simple syrup, which is how I'm going to make the cocktail, but this is still pretty much the same cocktail from 1940. So we're going to start off with 2 ounces of rye, half an ounce of simple syrup, and 2 dashes of Peychaud's bitters. Add ice, and we're going to stir for 40 seconds. I already have the Herbsaint in an atomizer bottle, so I can just spritz it into the glass. If you don't have an atomizer bottle, you can just add about 1/4 ounce of the Herbsaint and just kind of roll it until the glass is nicely coated. And strain. Express some lemon oils over the top. And there you have the Sazerac. Cheers. Yeah, that's really good. A nice spiciness from the rye, but it's not overly powering. The Peychaud's bitters and the Herbsaint work really well together. They both kind of have these anise, licorice type of vibes. So me personally, I'm not that big of a fan of absinthe and those kind of black licorice type of flavors, but I really enjoyed it in this cocktail. So it just goes to show you with something that has big, bold flavors like absinthe or herbsaint, how it works really well in cocktails. Also, I didn't mention this glass. This is the official glass that the Sazerac is served in. These glasses are really hard to find. I was able to find this one at a random liquor store when I was in San Francisco, but you can serve this in any kind of a small old-fashioned glass. So the next cocktail that I'm going to do isn't even one of the most popular or even well-known cocktails from New Orleans, but I feel it's one of the most underrated and it's one of my most favorite. And that cocktail is La Louisiane, or de la Louisiane. So this cocktail was invented as the Sazerac cocktail was still being developed in the late 1800s, and it was invented at the De La Louisiane restaurant in New Orleans. And it wasn't first seen in print until 1937 in the book Famous New Orleans Drinks and How to Mix Them. So for this cocktail, we're just going to swap out the simple syrup for Bénédictine and Sweet Vermouth. So we're going to start off with 1.5 ounces of rye, 3/4 of an ounce of Bénédictine, 3/4 of an ounce of Sweet Vermouth, and 2 dashes of Peychaud's bitters. Add ice and stir for 40 seconds. We're going to spritz the inside of a Nicanora glass with some Herbsaint and strain. Express some lemon oils. And there you have the La Louisiane. Cheers. That's really good. I love this cocktail. I don't know why it's not more popular than the Sazerac, maybe because the Sazerac was first, but this is a really good cocktail. The great thing about cocktails is that you can taste all the ingredients individually, but together at the same time. Really nice body with the rye, and the Bénédictine, again, really nice and herbal. I like the Bénédictine here than any of the Bénédictine cocktails I did in the Bénédictine video. I'm probably starting to say this in every video now, and that's the Sweet Vermouth that ties it all together. And it's so true. That's why Sweet Vermouth is so good in cocktails. It really is the glue that kind of ties the whole cocktail together. And again, really nice anise flavors from the Herbsaint and the Peychaud's bitters. So this is an absolute amazing cocktail, and you guys should definitely give it a try. So the next cocktail that I'm going to do is arguably the second most popular cocktail in New Orleans, right behind the Sazerac. And that cocktail is the Vieux Carré, which is French for Old Square. So this cocktail was invented in 1938 by Walter Bergeron at the Swan Room inside the Hotel Monteleone. And even though the hotel is still there, the bar isn't called the Swan Room anymore. It's called the Carousel Bar. I had the opportunity to visit this bar when I was in New Orleans, and this was a really cool experience. And the coolest thing about this bar is that the seats slowly rotate around the bar like a carousel. So for this cocktail, we're going to remove the Herbsaint altogether, bring in Angostura bitters, and to tie this cocktail all the way back to the beginning, Cognac. So here's the interesting story behind the creation of this drink. It was made as a tribute to the diverse multicultural communities in New Orleans. You had rye for the Americans, Cognac and Bénédictine for the French, Vermouth for the Italians, and bitters for the Caribbean influence. Now, this isn't an Italian vermouth, this is a French vermouth from Dolin. If you wanted to use an Italian vermouth, I have this one from Cochi Vermouth di Torino, but this one's a little bit more expensive at around $40 a bottle, whereas the Dolin costs around $15. So if you don't want to get the more expensive bottle, you don't have to, because me personally, I make a lot of cocktails, and I rarely go through an entire bottle of vermouth before I have to throw it out, because once you open vermouth, it lasts in the fridge anywhere from a month to maybe 4 months, give or take. And unless you're making a lot of cocktails, you're very rarely going to use the whole bottle, and you're more than likely going to be dumping some of it out. So for this cocktail, I'm going to do the garnish first and then set it aside, because it can take some time, because the cocktail calls for a lemon twirl, which can be a little bit tricky. So you don't want to be having a hard time preparing the garnish and having your cocktail dilute in the glass over the ice. So I'm going to start my lemon ribbon or zest, whatever you want to call it. Lemon spraying everywhere. Smells nice though. And I'm just gently going to curl this And you want to use a room temperature lemon for this because it'll hold shape better. Whereas if you take the lemon out of the fridge, it'll try to fight back against you. And then just kind of stretch it out. And then to keep the shape, I just put it under a hard surface. Maybe I'll put it under the Herbsaint bottle. So we're going to start off with 1 ounce of rye, 1 ounce of cognac, 1/4 ounce of Bénédictine, 1 ounce of sweet vermouth, 2 dashes of Peychaud bitters, and 2 dashes of Angostura bitters. Add ice. Stir for 40 seconds again. Strain into a chilled Nick or NOLA glass. Garnish with a lemon twist. And I'm going to do something a little special for you guys. And there you have the Vieux Carré. Cheers. Yeah, this one's actually a lot less sweeter. It's more spicier with the combination of the rye and the cognac. There isn't as much Bénédictine, so you don't get as much sweetness. A nice complexity from the bitters as well. It's not as sweet and savory as the Louisiane. I'd say this one's a little bit more closer to the Sazerac, but it's still a really good, nice, complex drink. So also for this cocktail, you don't have to use cognac if you don't want to because it can be pretty expensive. This bottle of Pierre Ferrand isn't available in Ontario. I got it online from Alberta, and it costs anywhere from about $60. So if you wanted to make this cocktail more cost effective, you can just use a normal brandy and you'd be okay. Okay, so that's it for today. Here you have 3 really amazing cocktails from New Orleans, and I gotta say that La Louisiane is my favorite, so start spreading the word, because it doesn't get as much recognition as the Sazerac or the Vieux Carré. I hope you enjoyed the history lesson on cognac in New Orleans, and if you guys haven't been to New Orleans yet, you really need to go. Go have a Sazerac at the Sazerac bar, and go have another Sazerac and a muffaletta sandwich at the Napoleon House, and make sure you go and visit the Carousel Bar. It's a really fun experience. Also make your way north out of the French Quarter to the Parkway Tavern where you can have some amazing po' boy sandwiches. And there's other bars in the French Quarter that you have to check out like Jewel of the South, Latitude 29, Cane and Table, and also head west out of the French Quarter into the Garden District. This is a beautiful area of New Orleans with some great bars and restaurants. Curious is one of the best innovative bars in New Orleans. Also visit Turkey and the Wolf where you can have some amazing sandwiches. I hope this video was as much fun for you as it was for me. Hit that like and subscribe button, follow me on Instagram for more recipes, and I'll see you in the next video. Cheers.